Okay, everyone, good afternoon. Good to see you all again. Hope that you're enjoying this springtime. We had a contest earlier that you're all welcome to join. I'd like to know what you do with leftover matzah. What's the most creative use you could think of for leftover matzah? So someone suggested roof tiles, other kinds of, yes, Bert, what do you got? Anything good for leftover matzah?
My daughter puts the equivalent of Nutella on it or chocolate and puts it in the fridge. And then you have this wonderful chocolate-based matzah.
Yeah, if you put enough sugar on something, even matzah could taste good.
That's like matzah bride, just the way it is with salt,
But I remember Jerry's Deli used to have matzah brie on the menu, and I used to see people order matzah brie. Now, I love matzah brie on Pesach, but I don't know, it's one of these strange things, like the day after Passover, it sort of loses its appeal. I don't know. It's one thing to do this to yourself during Pesach. It's another thing to have to do it the rest of the year.
When we eat matzah outside and you spill it on the floor, we joke that even the ants are not interested in eating the matzah.
Yeah, halach ma'anya, the achlu avatana, the arid Mitzrayim, the poor bread of slaves, right? Stan,
I have to disagree.
Okay.
I have to disagree. We eat it all year round. We love it.
Oh, in that case, I have a gift for you. Where do you live? You're going to see a dump truck pull up to your house in a few minutes, because I have enough. You get you collect it, and we got a box here and a box there, and all of a sudden the holiday's over, and I have a box here and a box there, and they're all open. Yeah,
it's bad.
It's amazing. It's amazing. What do you do with leftover matzah? Gloria, can you unmute so we can hear you?
Brian's trying to help me between.
Oh, there it is. There it is.
Hi, Brian.
How are you? How are you?
Good to see you, bro.
Thank you so much.
I freeze matzah.
Why?
It lasts forever.
It lasts forever without freezing it, because the bugs don't want it.
No, I think it comes out perfect when you freeze it, and you can even eat it. You don't even have to defrost it.
Frozen, yeah, no kidding, because it doesn't taste like anything anyway. So.
I can't tell you that.
I love it. I told you I was shopping. We went to Cambridge Farms, which is the kosher market over here in North Hollywood, and they had a display of shmura matzah. You know what shmura matzah is? It's the handmade matzah, guarded carefully from the time it was harvested. And if you've ever had it, you think matzah tastes bad? Shmura matzah makes matzah look gourmet. Anyway, they have it because it's made in these very traditional communities. So you can get it for $18 a box. You can get it for $28 a box. There's even a box that was $39.95. I see this fellow, this Hasidic dressed fellow, and he's talking to his wife in Hebrew about which one should we get. And I said to him in Hebrew, I said, Chaver, I said, my friend, just eat the box. You won't tell the difference. And he looked at me and said, you're right. Because if you blindfolded yourself and ate the matzah and then ate the box, you really couldn't tell the difference between the two. The box is actually tastier than the matzah. So it's just awful. One of the consumer magazines once did an analysis of children's breakfast cereals. And they analyzed, I think, Frosted Flakes, Kellogg's Frosted Flakes. They analyzed what happens if you eat the cereal and what happens if you eat the box. And they said that the box is more nutritional than the cereal. So this is where it is. This is where the world is. So anyway, welcome back. It's good to see everyone.
It's too cruel to donate to the food bank, isn't it?
What?
The leftover matzah.
You could donate it.
Yeah, but some poor hungry person is going to get matzah in their package, and they're going to say,
like,
"What did I do to deserve this?" Like it's hard enough to be poor and on the street. Now you're feeding me matzah. I mean, who knows? Who knows? And then what it does to your insides is quite remarkable. So, like in my family, my folks, you'd eat matzah, then you eat prunes.
Yes.
which always reminded me of like hitting the gas and the brake at the same time on your car. It's like your poor insides don't know whether they're coming or going. That's the problem. It's terrible. It's just awful. So this week, some of you have been with me these previous couple of nights. This is a very interesting week, and I want to just take a moment and highlight what makes this particular week so very interesting. So we finished Passover. Thank God. We finished Passover. The last Torah reading that is traditionally designated for Pesach, the one we did on Saturday, is the crossing of the Red Sea and the Song of the Sea, which in Jewish tradition is the moment when God's hand in history became visible. When our ancestors truly felt, if you read the story, and if you understand how Jewish tradition appropriated that moment generation after generation, that was the moment when we saw God's actions in history. There's a midrash which says that the lowliest person in Israel saw more of God standing at the Red Sea than the greatest prophets ever in history. Because in that moment, the divinity, as it were, God's action in history became palpable, became tangible, became real. And that's why the story, the Song of the Red Sea, is recited not just on Pesach, but every single day in our prayers. We sing Michamocha Ba'ilim Adonai. We do that in the morning and we do that in the evening, because that's the moment when we came to understand that our history doesn't belong to us alone. It's not simply a human history. It's what the Germans called a heilige Geschichte. It's a holy history. This is the history of God's action in the world. This is how we understand God's actions in the world. And that's what Jews carried with them into the generations of Israel, into the generations of Jewish history. So whenever there was a tragedy, whenever there was a catastrophe, they could assimilate the tragedy and the catastrophe because they truly believed that God was active in their history. And the book of Deuteronomy sets out again and again and again the mechanism. And the mechanism is that if you do mitzvot, if you live a life of righteousness, if you follow God's ways in the world, you will be rewarded. And the rewards will be material in the world. It will rain. You will have material prosperity and security. But if you sin, if you turn away from God's ways and follow other ways, then you will be punished, either with drought or with exile. The book of Deuteronomy is very clear about this. So there's a line in the prayer book that is recited in the Musaf Amidah, in which we say, Mipnei chataenu galinu me'artzenu. It was because of our sins that we were exiled from our land. So when Jews looked upon their lowly condition, when they experienced persecution, when they experienced exclusion, when they experienced castigation or exile, they saw this as divine punishment. Sometimes they made it a little easier on themselves by understanding that it wasn't punishment for their personal sins, but rather paying off the punishment of their ancestors. And they could see themselves in some way as righteous, but there was a sort of debt that had to be paid off. And this is the great Jewish ideology. And because suffering was then understood as payment for sin, as reimbursement, as it were, for sin, then the way that we approached persecution, the way we approached suffering, was with gestures of repentance. So the great Jewish day of remembering all of the bad stuff that ever happened to the Jewish people is Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av. And on that day, we fast. Now, why would you fast? A mourner doesn't fast. Quite the contrary. If you've ever been in a house of Shiva, there's food up the wazoo, right? You're fasting because the mechanism is we sinned, God punished us, we repent the sin, God will bring us back. All of this is detailed in the book of Deuteronomy, and that became the practice of Jews over the generations. That became the practice of Jews over the generations. Sin is a punishment. Sin brings the punishment of exile and persecution. Repentance brings us back to Eretz Yisrael. Now, 1951, a bill was put before the Knesset, the newly formed Knesset, the newly formed parliament of the state of Israel, that the state of Israel needed a day to remember the Shoah, the Holocaust. Now, the Holocaust is a long event. It begins, well, I mean, arguably, you could say it begins in Kristallnacht and goes all the way to the fall of Hitler. You could even extend the boundaries even farther. You could talk about from the rise of Hitler all the way to the end of the establishment of the state of Israel. I mean, you could really talk about an event that lasted almost 20 years. The question is, on which day do you commemorate the Holocaust? The United Nations established the day that the Russians liberated the Auschwitz concentration camp. I think that's in November. I forgot when it is. But the Jewish community wanted to do something different. And so the first proposal was that the holiday not just commemorate the suffering and the persecution of Jews at the hands of the Nazis, but actually it was going to be Yom HaShoah, the day remembering the destruction, Ugvura, and the heroism. Because the Zionists were kind of ashamed. The Zionists were kind of ashamed at the passive suffering of Jews in Europe. They wanted to embrace the story of the partisan fighters as the real story of the Holocaust. And the greatest story of the partisan fighters was the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. And the Warsaw, of course, was the biggest Jewish city in Europe. And when the Jews were put into the ghetto, and the ghetto was beginning to be liquidated. That is, they were taking the Jews to Auschwitz and Treblinka. A group of young people rose up and fought back against the Nazis. They literally held off the Nazis for about 3 weeks. And then the Nazis just decided to just bomb the hell out of the ghetto and destroy as many of them as they could find. So the original idea was that they would commemorate the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and that began on the 14th day of Nisan, right? Erev Pesach, right? So interestingly, the original date for Yom HaShoah was to be the 14th day of Pesach, which is Erev Pesach. It's the day before Passover. But the rabbis objected. And the rabbi said, you can't have a day that sad right up against Passover. But the rabbis suggested something equally difficult, which is they wanted to take the Yom HaShoah and they wanted to assimilate it into Tisha B'Av, into the national day of mourning for all the bad events of the Jewish people. And there, the Zionists objected to that because they said, we refuse to use the rites of repentance to think about the Holocaust as associated with Jewish sin. The Holocaust was not associated. It was not the recompense for Jewish sin. It was not a punishment by God. And so there was a standoff. And the compromise was the 27th of Nisan. The 27th of Nisan was in the middle of the uprising, but it wasn't during Pesach. It's the week after Pesach. It happens to be tonight. Tonight's the 27th of Nisan. So tonight is Yom HaShoah. But now you have the following really interesting dilemma. Really interesting to me because I read this stuff, I study this stuff, but it's kind of a heartfelt dilemma. We just had a holiday which concluded with a great celebration of God's actions in history, right? You have that line in the Haggadah, Lo al yedei malach v'lo al yedei seraph. It wasn't an angel and it wasn't a messengers, but God himself redeemed us from Egypt. And you have that song that we sing in the Haggadah, V'hisha Amda, the promise that God made to us, that God would protect us, has stood with us in all the generations. And then, the line of the song is, Shelo achad bilvad amar aleinu lechalotenu. It wasn't just one, it wasn't just Pharaoh who tried to destroy us, but in every generation, B'chol dor v'dor, omdim aleinu lechalotenu. They're always out to get us. And the last line of the song is V'HaKadosh Baruch Hu matzilenu miyadam. And God saves us from their evil. So that's how you ended Pesach just last week. And now, a few days later, it's Yom HaShoah. And now you have to look into the darkness of the Holocaust. How do you reconcile those two? How do you reconcile a God who acts in history to protect God's people and a day when 1 million Jewish children are remembered for having been destroyed deliberately by a civilization that embraced the evil of genocide? How do you understand the juxtaposition of those two events, those 2 days? And that's the dilemma. That's the dilemma that we're facing today. I mean, that makes it so very difficult That's the dilemma. Now, to make it harder, as as they say on television, but wait, but it makes it harder. Next week, literally next Wednesday night, is Yom Ha'atzmaut, is the celebration of the birthday of the state of Israel. And lots of Jews would like to say that the state of Israel's return, that the rebirth of the state of Israel, the creation of a Jewish country, the power that we assimilated, that we integrated when we took sovereignty in the state of Israel, is itself the hand of God in history. So now you have three events. You have the Pesach, you have Yom HaShoah, and you have Yom Ha'atzmaut. And the question is, what is the religious significance of any of these days? What is the religious significance of any of these days? How do you understand the vacillation, the oscillation between events so miraculously redemptive, so miraculous in how much they protected us, and events that are so brutally evil, just so brutally evil? And just to sort of set the context, I mean, it's not hard to make the case that the greatest act of redemption in all of Jewish history is Yetziat Mitzrayim, is the Exodus from Egypt, but the recreation of the state of Israel matches it. And you think about all of the Jewish communities that were rescued by Israel, the Jews of Arab lands, the Jews of Yemen, the Jews of Ethiopia, the Jews of the former Soviet Union, all rescued by the state of Israel. So you can easily say that Yetziat Mitzrayim, is the Exodus from Egypt, is matched by the recreation of the state of Israel. And the greatest act of destruction in all of Jewish history is destruction of the temple in the year 70. And you can easily see the Holocaust as matching the destructiveness of the destruction of the temple and the evil of that, the darkness of that moment. The problem is that Yetziat Mitzrayim and Churban Abayit, the Exodus from Egypt and the destruction of the temple, took place 1,500 years apart. We have a time to sort of integrate that. The Holocaust, the creation of the state of Israel, take place in the experience of one generation. How do you make sense of that? I mean, religiously, how do you make sense of it? We know how it worked politically. Although I got to tell you that even studying it politically, when you study it politically, it still doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, on the one hand, you can understand the social forces, the political and the cultural forces that drove German anti-Semitism. But it's sort of really hard to understand how a whole country conspires to do away with a population, and how human beings, people with families and kids and dogs, and all the things that make us normal, went to work every day in concentration camps, right? There's a famous book that came out in 1961 or 2. It was Hannah Arendt, the great German Jewish philosopher, was sent by the New Yorker magazine to report on the trial of Adolf Eichmann. Remember, Adolf Eichmann was a Nazi official who was captured in Argentina, smuggled back to Israel, and put on trial. And the Israelis were very proud that they got Eichmann. But Hannah Arendt writes an interesting book where she says the prosecutors are wrong. Adolf Eichmann is not some evil mastermind, some dark, demonic, satanic soul. Adolf Eichmann's an ordinary guy who's a bureaucrat. He was good at train schedules. And because he was so good at organizing train schedules, he's basically responsible for the destruction of 400,000 Hungarian Jews. But she points out that he had a wife and kids and a dog, and he'd go to work every day killing Jews, and he'd come home at night and live he had Jewish friends. He had Jewish neighbors. He was ordinary. The name of the book is The Banality of Evil, which means the ordinariness of evil. And so the question is, how do you understand that? How do you understand people are able to do that on the one hand? And then on the other hand, there's the question of how unlikely it was that the Jewish people would return to their own country and start and survive as a state, and statehood would come to us. And then how it was that they survived the onslaught of the Arab armies. You know that George C. Marshall, General Marshall, who was the most important Jewish, not Jewish, he wasn't Jewish, on the contrary, and the most important American leader, Secretary of State. And what he recommended to Truman not to recognize Israel. In fact, he threatened him. He said that if Truman recognized Israel, it would bring such a backlash among the Arab states that it would be very, very difficult for American foreign policy. And therefore, he said that Truman, if Truman recognized Israel, Marshall would resign and run against him in the next election. And Truman, to his credit, decided to hell with it. He's going to do it anyway. And 11 minutes after Ben-Gurion established the state of Israel, Truman, on behalf of the United States government, recognized the state of Israel. I mean, so there's miracles to be had even in the normal telling of the story. This question then becomes, how do we understand ourselves in this moment of our history? And that's what this week presents. That's what makes this week such an interesting week in the history, in the sort of flow of events, and as we remember them, to go from the high of Pesach to the low of Yom HaShoah and back up to Yom HaAtzmaut is just a remarkable up and down in the course of 3 weeks. Okay, that was all by way of introduction to say hello. It's good to see all of you again. So hello, it's good to see all of you again. Any questions, comments before we jump into the text today? Yes, Douglas, you're on. You have to unmute so I can hear you, sir.
Okay. The question I sent you by email. You dealt last night with the, premier theologians of Rabbi Schulweis and Greenberg.
Yeah.
And both of them came up with coherent theologies as to how to respond to God in the Holocaust, which dealt with personal responsibility at the core of their theologies.
Yeah.
And the criticisms that are leveled against both of those guys is that they were couching secular humanism, rationality, reason in religious language. And they're both deeply religious men. I know that, that. We've experienced it with them. How do they answer that?
Okay, I asked Schulweis about that many times. Because this was something that he faced every time that he talked. So just to bring everybody up to speed where Douglas is at. One of the answers given by a group of Jewish philosophers is to say, I no longer believe in a God who acts in history outside of the realm of human beings. No more miracles. The only miracle that I'm going to see in American history, in Jewish history, in world history, is what human beings do. And when human beings transcend, that is, they go beyond their own limitations, to do acts of responsibility, acts of moral courage, acts of moral action in the world, I'm going to identify that as godly. That's the hand of God in the world. So you have Yitz Greenberg, who's a wonderful philosopher, talking about the Jewish people learned that if God wasn't going to save us in the Holocaust, it's time for us to save us in the Holocaust. And that's what makes Israel a sacred product, not a sacred expression, not simply a secular expression of the Jewish people. But what makes it sacred is that it's human beings, the Jewish people, protecting themselves. Okay? We say Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut. Now, let me explain that sentence. Hallel is a group of psalms that are added for holidays where we recognize miracles. You say Hallel on Pesach, you say Hallel on Sukkot and Shavuos, you say Hallel on Rosh Chodesh, you say Hallel on Hanukkah. You say Hallel for all those moments when we recognize a miracle in the world. So you say Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut. Okay? So that's Greenberg. Rabbi Schulweis goes even farther. Rabbi Schulweis says, look, I really can't believe in a God who's out there anymore. I just don't believe in that God out there anymore. The God that I look for is when human beings do more than one could expect them to do. They transcend their limitations and their boundaries, and they act in a way which makes the world more whole, which makes the world more peaceful, when they act in a way which is godly. And so Rabbi Schulweis sort of gives up the whole idea of God as a noun and talks about God as an adverb. Things that we do which are godly. And the only noun he's going to use is godliness. I pursue godliness. So when I talk to the kids in the school and I try to teach them this idea, they get it really quickly. Say, what's a noun? person, place, or thing. I say, good. Is God a noun? They all say yes. I say, okay. Now I want you to use your imagination. What's a verb? A verb, something you do. Good. What if God, the word God, is a verb? And they all laugh. I said, no, don't laugh. How good are you at Godding? And they all laugh. I say, well, what would you have to do Godding? And some bright little kid will say, well, my mom was sick. I brought her lunch. That's Godding. And someone else will say, I have a friend who was sad. I gave them a hug. That's Godding. Kids get this right away. That the actions we do, which transcend our limitations of self and really show care for the world and for each other, these are species of something that's not simply the normal, not simply human, but goes beyond us. Okay? So these responses come largely out of their own meditations, because both of them, they were both living in America, but both of them were deeply, deeply, deeply affected by the Shoah. Now, Douglas's question is this. Whenever Rabbi Schulweis taught this, or Rabbi Greenberg, the charge was, this isn't religion, this is secular humanism. Okay? Now, so Rabbi Schulweis's answer, he was very clever. He said, first of all, it's not, even if it is, so what? I mean, so you're labeling it, but this is my understanding of the sacred in life. And Rabbi Schulweis would say, I'm looking for allies in all the sectors of life. I'm looking for people who will work with me to fight for what's right, But the real answer is what you said a moment ago, which is both of these men are deeply religious, in the sense that for Rabbi Schulweis, to call something godly wasn't simply to say that it's good. It's to say that it's absolutely good, and that it's absolutely incumbent upon me to do it. So, for example, he founds an organization called Jewish World Watch, because he's reading Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times talking about the genocide going on in Darfur, which is Western Sudan. And Rabbi Schulweis is so taken with this, and he decides you can't be a Jew and tell the story of the Holocaust and then turn the page of the newspaper and not be touched by the fact that there are people being slaughtered, children, men, women, being slaughtered in this area of the world, and not do something about it. That genocide calls to me because I am a Jew, because I've experienced my own history. I understand that fighting genocide is something that is a mitzvah. It's something that I gotta do, that it's something that is incumbent upon me. So the difference that Rabbi Schulweis's answer would be that, and I think his answer was more in the way that he acted, in the way that he taught it. It's that it's not secular humanism in the sense that I have a choice. These are actions of goodness that give me no choice, that I'm simply called upon to do it. I don't know if there's been an article in the paper, I don't know if you've been watching this. There was a woman in New York City, an Asian American woman who was beat up in New York City. Did you see the story of the Times? Right, she was walking past some building, some nice apartment building, and some guys jumped up and just started beating on her. Now she survived, but one of the questions, there was a doorman right inside the door of the building, two doormen in the building, and they didn't do anything. The question is, why didn't they do anything?
They got fired, by the way.
I know, but that's the question: is how can
I understand?
You're exactly right. But the real question is, how can you watch a human being be assaulted, a little lady being assaulted on the street, and not want to go do something? I mean, and so the question is, at what point do actions of moral courage call upon you and demand something of you? That's where you're going beyond the bounds of, say, secular humanism. And you're talking about something that we would call religious, which is like deeply built into my being, deeply built into my identity. Now, what they're not going to say is what religious people say, it comes from God above. Not that it comes from God above, but it comes from the God within. And that's where Schulweis locates God. It's the God within. Now, Rabbi Schulweis's answer to the Holocaust was to go find Christian rescuers, people who were called upon by the God within to rescue Jews during the Holocaust. And every time he found a story or a person who'd been rescued, every time he found a person who was one of the rescuers, it verified his idea that there are actually people who respond to the God within. And there are actually things that we're called upon to do that are godly acts. And if you can find godly acts in the darkness and the misery of the Holocaust, how much more so are we called upon to do those things in the prosperity and the security of the lives we live? And that was Rabbi Schulweiss's answer. Is it a satisfying answer? It depends. If you're the kind of person who wants a God who's talking to you from heaven, it's probably not a satisfying answer, right? I remember he came home once. He came home from a conference once. He was speaking to some young rabbis, and he gave this philosophy. And he was very disturbed because one of the persons, he said, Rabbi, I want a God who can hug me. And Schulweiss says, God doesn't hug you. Schulweiss says, God yells at you, tells you what to do. And he said, he was very disturbed. He says, I understand the impulse. I certainly understand the impulse to want a God who protects me, who envelops me, who listens to me, who accompanies me. But he said, Schulweiss said to me, I can't believe in that God, not after what we've experienced. So it was he was very torn by that experience, very touched by that experience. Lois, hi.
Hi. My problem with Schulweiss's godliness is, what if your God is Hitler or Stalin or Mao?
So the question is, yes. So let's explore that. So the question then is how do you know what's a godly act? How do you know what's a godly act?
If you reject that there's a God, there's a God like Rubinstein did.
Yeah.
Then where did this godliness come from? And what's
very good question? Okay, but let me make your life even harder. Okay, would that be okay? Okay.
Sure.
Yeah. What if you do? What if you believe in a God who tells you that the highest form of religious expression is to fly an airplane into an office building and kill 3,000 innocent people? Does having a God who speaks from heaven really release you from the problem of what's moral and what's not? You know, and I know that 9/11 was a travesty. You know, and I know that the Inquisition was a travesty. Now, how do we know that? How do we know? We know let's be personal about it. You know, and I know that what Baruch Goldstein did was a travesty, right? That what Yigal Amir did was a travesty. The guy who killed Rabin. They thought that was a religious act. They thought God wanted them to do these horrible, horrible acts. The Bible tells us, and here think about the story of Abraham. God says to Abraham, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, if everything God says is moral, Abraham should have said, yes, sir. What does Abraham say? Abraham says, you can't do that. Right? What if there are 50 innocent people? You can't destroy the city. It would be unjust. Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. Shall not the judge of all the earth do justice? Now, what's happening in that encounter? What's happening in that encounter is that Abraham has a moral sense which is independent of his belief in God. And he measures his belief in God by his moral sensibility. And when God says, I'm going to do something, and Abraham says it's immoral, he can say to God, you can't do that. That's immoral. Now, that idea of you have an internal sense of morality, which is independent of your religious conviction, and it is your internal sense of morality that measures religious conviction. That's what keeps you and I from flying airplanes into office buildings or gunning down people whose religions are different than us, because we have a moral sense that's different. Now, where did we get that moral sense? Now, here's where the paradox comes from. We got that moral sense from the same religious tradition. So there is a sort of dialectical relationship. The religious tradition that raised us taught us morality, and then we apply that morality back to the religious tradition that raised us. And there's a conversation between the two, but it's always a tension and a conversation. Okay, let's take a more contemporary and less violent example. When I was in seminary at JTS in 1970s, my wife Nina wanted to become a rabbi. The Jewish Theological Seminary did not ordain women. We protested. There was all kinds of commissions. And we said to the administration of the school and to the rabbinical community, we meaning a bunch of students, you have taught us that we are all created in the image of God. You have taught us that we're all covenanted, part of the covenant of Abraham and Sarah. You have all taught us that Torah was given to all of us on Mount Sinai. Why on earth can't a woman be a rabbi? And some of our teachers came back and said, because that's what the tradition says. And we said, it's wrong. It's immoral. It's wrong. Now, how did we know it was immoral? Because you taught us that everyone's created in the image of God, and we were all standing at Sinai, right? You taught us that morality. Now you can't escape from that morality. Same thing happened when the question was, should gay and lesbian Jews, LGBTQ Jews, be welcomed into our synagogues? People said, oh, it's unnatural, it's perverted, and the Torah thinks it's a sin. And Rabbi Schulweis stood on the Bima in 1992 and said, our children, our LGBTQ children are welcome in the shul. Why? Because that's who we are. That's what Torah teaches. So our moral sensibility mediates our religious convictions, and our religious convictions support and reinforce our moral sensibilities. And there is a dialectical relationship between the two. That's what happens when you have a God above. Okay. Now, what Schulweis simply is saying, if I already have a moral conviction and it's my religious tradition, that's what's godly. There's no external source for godliness. It doesn't come from, no one shouts down, Feinstein, no lobster. I can assure you that never happened, right? But what happens instead is I learn my tradition, and my tradition teaches me how to comport myself in the world and how to think about what's right and wrong. And my tradition gives me lots and lots of clues about where I'm going to find godliness. And then I have to make moral choices, moral decisions. And that's not easy. And those moral choices and moral decisions are never certain. All of us who have ever had to make tough decisions in life know there's no certainty in this business. That's what it means to be a grown-up. Now, I happen to have a cousin who is a big Chabadnik. And he tells me all of my decisions are certain because the Rebbe tells me what to do. And I say, I respect that. I respect that. I have friends who are very Orthodox and they have a Rebbe. I only have one problem with that. Whatever the Chabad rabbi said was right, the Satmar rabbi said was wrong. Now, wait a minute. How can you have two rabbis who are so frum, with big, long gray beards and long, long, long lives studying Torah, and they say opposite things, right? I mean, the joke is that there's a rabbi on the north side of Pico who will tell you it's kosher, and there's a rabbi on the south side of Pico who will tell you it's treif. I mean, seriously, I'm not kidding. There really is, by the way. I mean, you all know this, by the way. In Israel, there's a chief rabbi. It's actually a political position, but there's a chief rabbi. But you know what the funny thing is? You ready for this? There are two. Only the Jewish people would have two chief rabbis, right? Now, anyone who's ever tried to run an organization with two chair people knows what happens, okay? Which means what? That you have to make choices. You have to make choices based on your own intelligence, your own moral sensitivity, your own conscience. And we try to train each other. We try to train and reinforce each other's sense of morality. And what I'm trying to say to you, Lo, is I really appreciate the question. And the answer is not going to be satisfying because there is no absolute morality that you can look in a book and say, oh, that's what I got to do. In the end, it comes down to being an adult and making moral choices like we all do and hoping that we did it right. How many times did I go to bed at night and say to Nina after I yelled at my kid, God, I hope I did that right. I hope I didn't just mess up the kid. And her answer always was, don't worry, nothing 10 years of psychotherapy can't fix. Right? Right. So, I mean, it's a beautiful question. And Rabbi Schulweis's answer is there's no absolute. It's all about the tradition that teaches me what's right and wrong, and which I so appreciate. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Lois. David comes next, but Lois gets the follow-up.
I also felt like I understood how he could maintain, or any of us could maintain, observance and be rational and whatever we called it, humanism, and hold these things at the same time. It's that what you called paradox, which all I know is I don't experience these kind of intellectual or spiritual questions as so binary. Like I feel Rubenstein, who was a teacher of mine in my college years, and who I mean, he so impacted me that it's too binary. I mean, what I think I learned through my years in Jewish communal service, those of you who know me a little better, is that it isn't one way or the other. And we become very binary now. We're either, libs or conservative, and even ACLU made a decision and couldn't stay in the middle. And right. I'm in the middle, even politically, which don't tell my children I said this.
No, I understand that perfectly.
But it's both things are true at the same time.
Which is a very nice way to put it.
Or wrong. Well, it's hard. It's much harder than being a Christian, and I understand Christianity better from listening to you.
I wouldn't dump on the Christians. I think being a sensitive, conscientious Christian is also very hard.
Yeah, but they find comfort in that things will get straightened out afterward.
Okay, and there are a lot of Jews who believe that too,
Yeah, well, okay.
No, you're exactly right.
My sermonizing of the day.
I resonate with you. What I'm trying to, I think this is, how do I put this right? Adult religion is hard. To be a kid is easy. I mean, to be a kid, somebody tells you what to do, you do it. It's when you start to think for yourself that things are always going to be hard, politically, culturally, morally. I so resonate with what you said. You're exactly correct. So you're in the right place. So in this setting, we give you a lot of hugs. Okay. Okay. Let's see. David, and then Stanley, and then Bert. Go ahead.
I think that wonderful conversation and what you just had with Lois and what she expressed, so wonderful. It may speak to what I already wanted to say, but only that I just wanted to say that it doesn't have to be either or. It doesn't have to be that there's no God, that Jewish had a certain belief of a God within. Fine, I like that. And also I happen to have this feeling that there's something greater than me. And they can coexist in just that aspect of it. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah. Look, the truth is that in the realm of mathematics, you have a certain standard of logic, which says X and not X cannot both be true. That's in the realm of mathematics. But in the realm of spirit, in the realm of human life, X and not X are always both true. Always both true. Think about any human circumstance, right? I want my kid to be independent. I want my kid to be connected to me, right? I want to lose myself in my marriage and my love. I want to remain a person, an individual with my own ambitions, needs, desires, and impulses, right? I am shaped by my society, and I shape the society. X and not X, the two contradictory things, are always true. That's what makes being a human being interesting. Now, maybe from God's perspective, it all works out logically, but in the world that we live in as human beings, it's always that way. It's always going to be both and instead of either or. And that's why one of the things that Rabbi Shaw always taught me, it's the first chapter of his book, is be very wary of either or choices. When someone breaks it in half and says, either you're for this or you're for that, look for the hidden middle. Look for the hidden middle, because that's where the truth is going to lie, right? The great philosopher Isaiah Berlin, beautiful Jewish English philosopher, once said, to every complicated, deep, thoughtful question, there is always a simple, easy solution, which is always wrong. Okay? So seek simplicity and then be suspicious of it, said Bertrand Russell. Okay, let's see. Stanley Schroeder has the next one.
I wanted to add to your story of the unlikeliness of how Israel became into being, going back to the three Zionists from the World War I era on. were so three unlikely people, so different in Jabotinsky, in Weizmann, and in Ben Gurion, from three different points of view and three different ways of doing things to, let's say, making Herzl's dream come true.
Mm-hmm.
So
this is what I'm going to give a talk about this next week. My Tuesday night talk next week. I'm going to tell you why they've had 4 elections in Israel and they're about to have the 5th. There's a reason for it. No. There's a very important reason. It's what happens when you build a country before you build a political theory. And I'm going to show you how this works. Okay. It's sort of like cooking something before you finish getting all the ingredients for the recipe. And you end up with the kind of indeterminate politics that's going on in Israel right now. That plus the fact that they're Jews, but that's another story. Bert, you're up next.
Okay, a couple of things to tie together. Let me start with the attack on the Asian woman in New York, and your appropriate question of why didn't they do anything. At that time, I also thought about your other comment about the Holocaust and why didn't they do anything. The idea of never again didn't seem to move out to the greater world community. I think part of the thing that I'm beginning to become comfortable with is trying to reconcile Schulweis's view of godliness and the idea of free will. And I think something you said today about we have an internal moral compass helps me tie those together, but they only tie it together because of something else you said about our cultural heritage and religious upbringing. So we're given a path in the Bible, but free will says we can or we cannot follow it, or follow it as far as we want to follow it. And if you don't have that upbringing, if you don't have that basis on which to make rational decisions, free will may let you go to work and cook Jews and then go home and cook dinner. And you're comfortable with that, but I'm not.
That's hopefully what it does, is that it opens your eyes and makes you aware and mindful of your own moral choices and then what the implications of those choices are. And then it makes you feel something. There's also an emotional capacity. My mother used to talk about Rachmanis. Rachmanis is an interesting, Rachmanut. How would you translate Rachmanis? I have Rachmanis on somebody. Pity isn't right the word, because pity reduces somebody. I feel for them. I have empathy for them. There's an emotional component to this, right? You see homeless people on the street, you say to you, I have Rachmanis, I feel something. It raises an emotional response in you. And I think that's also part of our history and part of our culture. Really nicely said. Andy.
I keep thinking back on what you're taught, so you're given a perspective, and everyone and ultimately we form our own ideas based upon all these different perspectives. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the most important thing I'm going to stress, because I had a great teacher, Rabbi Furman, explain to me that people today, and this was back in the day, they want to be precise. They take a pen, a fine point pen, and they're going to write it out, and this is what it's going to be so you can understand it. He goes, it's more like a paint can. And when you pour the paint can, it looks like I'm understanding it. It's a straight line. It's pulling down until it hits that canvas and it starts spreading out. And now what's happening is you're opening your ideas and you're seeing all these different concepts of different things. And now you have to be understanding of what all of that is encompassing. Mm-hmm. And by doing that, it helps us understand why I might not agree with why people do what they do. I can make my own decisions on what I feel is right. And so when it's interesting, you were talking about the holidays. I look at the holidays are time, it's irrelevant of what the times are and what they're supposed to mean. that's that time. That's the time I'm supposed to focus on, you know, the high of the end of Passover. I look at the end of Passover as a high because we're eating regular food, but obviously there's a high at the end of Passover. Then there's the solemnness of the Holocaust. Then there's the you know, you have, you know, multiple holidays where you have a fast before Purim. I was going to say, like the fast of Esther and all these different things that we're always kind of put back in check. It's kind of like a reset, and that's how I've always viewed religion, because I think sometimes we don't want to get too high, too low. You want to always look at different perspectives.
Okay. Okay. I mean, I think that's a really nice way to put it. I mean, because life is like that. You have these moments of ups and moments of downs, and to really live the experience of a people is to live these moments. Thank you. That was really nice. Stan, and then Ed, and then Arthur. You have to unmute, sir, please. Unmute. There you go. There you go.
I've always felt it was incumbent on me to follow our traditions.
Mm-hmm.
I started having doubts about an old man with a white beard sitting on a throne somewhere in outer space directing all of this. And then I read Rabbi Schulweiss's book in the early 90s, For Those Who Can't Believe. And it really made a lot of sense to me. I mean, that's where he said, don't look for God, the noun, look for God, the adverb. And it's really helped me.
Thank you. It really does. I mean, at least it challenges you to think about what you do want to believe. That, I mean, even if you disagree with him, he's such a he's a provocative thinker. He makes you think. He makes you really explore these ideas. I mean, look inside and ask yourself, what do I want to believe? What's important to me to believe? Yes, Ed, please.
Yes, even though we try to keep politics out of these religious discussions, but to get to your feeling of either or, which makes it very difficult for us to resolve issues today. Our politics today are either or. Either you agree with me or you hate children, or you agree with me or you hate women. Either you agree with me or you hate minorities. And it works the other way too. It's very, very difficult to live daily life with that over our entire economy and our issues of today.
Yeah.
You're right. It shouldn't be either or. There's got to be some middle road here.
Yeah, there's a polarization. What he said is there's a polarization in our politics, where, you know, that all issues seem to be divided into either ors, and then they get absolutized. So it's not that, you know, I'm not sure this is a good allocation of government resources. It's you must hate babies. You must eat babies for breakfast. That's the kind of person you are. Or you must, I mean, it becomes so very difficult that you can't have a conversation. I mean, one of the things that I see, for example, I see this in the Jewish world all the time is this idea that right away, if I disagree with you, I'm a Nazi. It slips quickly into Holocaust imagery, and people, you're a capo, you're a Nazi. I saw someone, as a friend of mine, was accused yesterday of a blood libel. You know, like a person who I think is a really wonderful person whose politics I agree with sometimes and disagree with, but the person that was writing about that person wrote that this person is such an anti-Semite that I mean, come on. I mean, you can't have political discussions if the person who disagrees with you is immediately labeled and stamped with the stamp of a Nazi. You're exactly right. It makes politics impossible. Yes, Arthur.
Yeah, you know, I think I want to put this a little more precisely. If X or if not X, or the law of the excluded middle, however you want to pursue, you know, Aristotelian logic, there's another type of logic that everybody's referring to in their talk called fuzzy logic. And fuzzy logic assigns a number between 0 and 1. Everyone's alluding to it, and let's just pin it down. Basically, many of our appliances work on that. When something gets up to such a level, not complete failure, then basically there's an alarm set, things of this nature. And I think that goes with, many of the ways we think, and we just think we're constrained by if, X or if not X, but really our lives are a fuzzy form of logic. Now, secondly, on a mathematical level, and I'm just staying in this vein, game theory pretty much tells all of us, if we're in opposition to someone's point of view, is to see what they did on their previous behavior and then basically follow suit. If they were good, you be good. If they were bad, you be bad. And this goes on, on a nuclear down to a personal level. And we're employing that ourselves, and we're not maybe fully aware of it. Additionally, you get somebody like Chomsky, and Chomsky basically is talking about our language is hardwired into our brains. And that's how we construct our language and our verbs and our subjects and et cetera, et cetera. Well, perhaps our sense of, right and wrong may be hardwired. I don't know, but getting back into the fuzzy area, it may well be like, where is someone immoral? Is it immoral if you're an engineer to work on be a weapon that will kill people, and you're getting paid for it and your family depends on it? How different, and where on a fuzzy level, say between 0 and 1, is that a 0.3? But if somebody is going to put someone in a camp, is that a 0.9? So I'm just saying, I have a little thing above my computer. It says "D omnibus dubitandum," doubt everything,
including that.
Yeah, including that, and I'm just saying,
okay.
When we want perfection, when you want to get something precise, you are basically saying, I'm not going to get Freudy on this, but I think, who knows what it is we really want, and I just think what you do, I want to commend you, do a wonderful job, but I'm just saying much of today's world is operating on fuzzy logic, not the law of the excluded middle. And
all right, well, as a guy who's had a beard since I'm 19 years old, I'm going to accept fuzzy logic as the way that God wanted me to be. So thank you all very much for this discussion. This was great today. And we'll continue next week. Take care, wear your mask, get your vaccine, stay well. Talk to you soon. Take good care.